So first of all, I'll start off with the obligatory about Southwick slide. So if you're not familiar with Southwick, we are in Hamden County. We're that little part of Massachusetts that juts down into Connecticut. And two takeaways from this slide are, first of all, we share the West River Basin with two other permanent communities, West Springfield and Russell. West Springfield has property in Southwick, and that's their primary water source. And the other takeaway is that we are primarily a bedroom community. Over 90% of our water use is for residential use. So why do we have why has Southwick been implementing water restrictions? So we have a permit that was issued in 1996. As Jen noted during her discussion, these permits were reviewed periodically, and we did have an update in our permit in 2014. It was completed in 2014 under that 5-year review. And as part of that process, we were granted this special condition 7, which require the town to implement water restrictions under 1 or 2 scenarios. So the first scenario was we were able to choose between the calendar restrictions or streamflow restrictions. Jen talked about both of those earlier on. We've always followed the streamflow restrictions, and I'll go over that in a minute. And we are also required to implement restrictions if there was a drought based on the Drought Management Task Force advisory that was administered by the EOEA office. So let's see. So we have a permit in the Westfield River. That is our streamflow gauge. And our permit says if the mean daily streamflow in that gauge drops below a certain threshold for 3 consecutive days, we are required to implement restrictions. And those numbers are different in May and June versus July through September. And that is for the fish spawning season in May and June. That's why there's a higher threshold during those 2 months. And then if we exceed those same numbers for 7 consecutive days, then we can pull out of the restrictions. The second trigger was whether there is a drought advisory status for the region. Jen talked about this earlier, but we are required to implement restrictions if we are in a level 1 or higher drought. And there's no different criteria, but whether it's a level 1 or level 4, our standards are the same. And so here's the thresholds. Again, Jen talked about this, but if our residential usage is 65 gallons or lower, we can implement 2 days per week of restrictions. Historically, Southwick has always been above 65 gallons per day. So we have been implementing restrictions one day a week. And then that same 1 day a week would also trigger if there was a drought-based trigger. So the way that we divvy up that 1 week across, that one day per week across the town, we adopted a north-south odd even scenario here. So if you're in the north part of town and you have an even number house, your day to water is Tuesdays. So the 4 days that we do allow water is Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, or Thursday based on your location. And then there is no outdoor water use allowed on Friday, Saturday, or Sunday. And I think this actually works out pretty well for us. We don't want to set up a scenario where we're taxing any one part of the water system any more than the others. So I think this setup works pretty well for us. There are a couple of exemptions in our permit, and I know Jen went through these a little bit in her slides. I will talk about these a little bit more later on, but we can establish new lawns and plantings during the months of May and September. And then irrigating public parks and fields between outside the hours of 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. And then if you want to use a handheld hose for your lawns, flower gardens, whatever, you can do that any time of day. So how do we approach this? So there was a trigger was met. What do we do? First of all, I develop a flyer. It's a 4-page document. It has kind of the who, what, when, where, and whys of the restrictions. I'll post that flyer to the town website, and on the next slide, I'll show a screenshot of what that flyer looks like. We also have a code. It's called Code Red, but it's like a reverse 911. You may be more familiar with that type of system. but it's a way where I can notify the public through emails, texts, or phone calls about the restrictions. So I do send out that code red call when we do implement the restrictions, and also I do the same when we pull restrictions out. I do the same code red call. We have some signage, which I'll show you a picture of what that looks like, but we do post signage around town. And the town does not have any social media presence officially, but as you can imagine, it does get picked up by folks and it does get out in that manner. So here's a kind of picture of the handout that I do publish. I'll update it throughout the year as needed. And that slide that I presented a few slides ago regarding the north-south odd even regions, I do include that in the same notice. But this I think answers most of the questions that most residents have regarding why we've been going in restrictions. And here's a couple of the signage that we put out. Like I said, we have maybe 10 or 15 of these signs we put out around town. We'll put them at the main entrances into town. And we also do have some more affluent neighborhoods that do use more outdoor water use than others. So we'll strategically put these signs, closer to those neighborhoods as well. So how do we monitor for outdoor water use? And I'm interested. There's 3 other systems that are presenting after me today. I think you're going to find that all 4 of us monitor this in a different manner based on what resources we have available to us. So I'm interested to hear what they have to say and how they do it. But for Southwick, we use mostly our water meter reading system. We have it's called the Census FlexNet system. We get all of our meter reads come back to us every day. 4 times a day, we get a data dump, and we can get hourly readings from all of our water customers through that data. And what we do is we try to find trends in those readings. If there is, if there's a high spike in water use during, odd hours, say early morning hours, we try to find those trends, and that might indicate if there is outdoor water use. We don't have staff that's working, during the midnight hours. We're going to see that most people that are doing outdoor water use are doing it between midnight and 6 a.m. We don't have staff out driving around. But if we do see something like maybe early morning, you can see water, ponding or pooled by in front of the property. The asphalt's wet. That may be an indication we should look at that property. We do have some people that, call about their neighbors. So again, we not a lot, but we do get a few of those. And again, based on that data, we'll go back and look at the water meters and see what those readings are telling us. So here's what we typically do, and I'll tell you, it's not a easy process. I have one office manager who spends a few hours every day in the summer going and looking at all this data, looking for violators of the restrictions. But what we typically do is we'll take we'll pick a time period, 2 or 3 day time period, and it's usually the weekends because our allowed days are Monday through Thursday. So we'll pick 2 or 3 days, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, and we'll try to just do a query of all the biggest water users in our system, and then we'll just go line by line, basically one account for the X, and pull up their weekly and daily usages. And this is an example of one from a property, one of our bigger violators from last year, but this is their weekly usage during the month, from 7/3 to 7/9. And don't be fooled by the bar sizes here. If you can read it, the usage on the right, it's actually pretty consistent, 3,100 gallons every day for those 7 days. So what we would do is we would drill down and look at their hourly usage during these timeframes. And you can see in these bars, there's these 2 days, the 5th and the 6th of July. You can see obviously the bars be starting at 2 o'clock in the morning and ending at 7 o'clock. And it's very consistent, not just these 2 days, but the 2 days after that. Obviously, in our mind, this is a outdoor irrigation system set on a timer, and this would certainly follow up. We would certainly follow up with this customer with the enforcement process, which I'll talk about in a few minutes here. Sometimes we have situations where, you know what, it's not clear. What do we do? You know, based on the meter readings, you know, the top bar here, you know, it looks like there's some high usage, you know, about 300 and 400 gallons an hour between 9 and 10 a.m. Then it peters down, then a little bit more about 9 o'clock in the afternoon or in the evening. In this situation, if it's not clear, you know, we probably would not follow up unless if we saw trends like this, you know, in the days before, afterwards, or, you know, even the same day of the week, you know, the following week. If we could see some trends in this situation, then we may think that's a outdoor water use violation. Otherwise, we probably just kind of keep it on the side and monitor it. The one on the chart on the bottom, again, this is high outdoor water, high water use, you know, 400 plus gallons. It's very same, you know, same usage every hour for 5-6 hour block. I would say most likely this is an outdoor hose running, probably filling a pool. And again, in this situation, unless if there was more history on this account, just based on this one day alone, this in our mind would not trigger a violation, and we would move on, but we just keep it in the back of our mind. So what do we do? If we catch you, what's the enforcement process? So first of all, I'll tell you what our bylaws state. The town bylaws state that if for your first violation is a $50 fine, and then any subsequent violation is $100. So that's what the bylaws state. Here's what we typically do for all of our customers, and this resets every year. So if there were violations last year, we will reset the same enforcement process this upcoming year. So the first violation or suspected violation, we'll send you a written warning, and I'll mail the handout that I showed you earlier, the 4-page document. I recognize that not everybody is on social media, or, you know, maybe they don't see the signs, and maybe they're a hermit. So I'll give them the benefit of the doubt that, you know, they didn't get the notice, or they didn't get the message that we have implemented restrictions. But with the handout, there is definitely no doubt that they are duly notified after this notice. Then we'll wait a couple weeks, and we'll just kind of track their usage. If we find that there's no change in habit, we'll send them a $50 fine, and that's regardless of how many days they used outdoor water during that 2 or 3 week time period. They get one $50 fine, and we'll wait again. And wait 2 more weeks, and if that violation continues, then we bump it up to the $100 fine. And again, that's if they watered every day in that 2 week time frame, they still got the $100 fine. So I would say that in most situations, 80% of the people they stop their usage after the $50 fine. We do have some people that do continue and that do push it. And so if they got the second fine, $100 fine, and they still didn't stop their usage, again, we wait 2 more weeks. But if that violation continues, then they get the big fine. They get a $100 fine for each day in that, you know, 2+ week period. And this is when I get the angry phone calls and, you know, the complaints about this. You know, one common complaint I got was, oh, you know, I was okay paying a $100 fine every other week. That it's worth that to me to save my lawn, but $100 every day, you know, that's exceeding. I can't do that. So that's not fair. So I'm like, well, that's it. Is you were duly notified. You know, the law's the law. We got to follow the regulations. That is what it is. And then, so if that person does continue on after getting that first $100 fine per day, you know, we'll continue that throughout the year until the restrictions are over or they stop their practice. I did note that in our permit, it does allow people to establish new lawns during May and September. I do not issue fines in either of those 2 months. My take is if someone wants to buy a bag of grass seed and overseed their lawn during those months, to me, that's a new lawn. And I'm not gonna, you know, I can't, how do I know they're not overseeding their lawn during those 2 months versus using it, you know, when they shouldn't be. So we don't issue fines in May and September for that reason. So last year, we really ramped up this enforcement process. We've been doing the restrictions every year since 2016. But last year we really ramped it up. And so I had three people who appealed their fines. The value of their total fines range from $1,500 to over $3,000. And so I had to go to district court and they're fine to speak with a magistrate and justify why I sent these fines out, and the homeowners are there as well, explain their position. I can tell you that none of them denied using outdoor water use. I gave the magistrate a packet that was probably a half-inch thick every day of their usage. I had a chart of everyday usage throughout the summer. I highlighted which days, they were violating. None of them denied using the water, but they came up with other excuses, like their irrigation system wasn't programmed right. They weren't at town. They had a financial hardship, et cetera, et cetera. I will say in all three situations, the fines were basically cut in half. And it really the magistrate really didn't give any reason why. I think that's kind of like their talking to others. That's kind of like their protocol is they typically cut the fines regardless of what the issue is. In our situation, they cut them in half. I was quite disappointed by that. We put a lot of work into appealing the fines, appealing the whole process. A lot of effort on our end, and to have the fines cut in half, I thought was not really fair, but it is what it is. So here's a summary of our enforcement over the past 7 years. So I said we started in 2016. The first, it's 2017, we were not required to implement restrictions, but every year since then, we have been. So you can see the first line, it shows number of days and restrictions and how it varies. I think the takeaway here is the value of the fines issued, the bottom column. You can see the first 3-4 years, we really didn't do a whole lot in fines. The first year, a couple, but nothing in 2018 or 2019. I think that was probably part in fact that, the number of days we were in restrictions was a lot shorter than we have been in the last couple of years. But our last year, we really ramped up our enforcement. And so we issued over $15,000 in fines last year. And I imagine, I don't see us doing anything more this year than we did last year. But it certainly took us a few years to get to this point where we are now. So how does that impact the water department? Obviously there's a loss in revenue, which I tried to calculate, and I'll show on the next page. We did have to adjust some of our rates, not only because of loss in revenue, but also because we had some other ongoing projects. And really the key is, okay, well, how did that change the habits? Did our residential use change over those, 2 or 3 years where we really clamped down on the restrictions? So first of all, the loss in revenue, I would say that's pretty hard to quantify. I didn't put a whole lot of time into it. I took a baseline year, 2017, where we had no restrictions, and I carried that forward the last 5 years and 6 years to kind of see where I thought we would have been in revenue versus what we actually brought in. And, I think it's fair to say that we had at least 10% loss in revenue, if not more, over that timeline. That could be attributed to implementing those restrictions. We did adopt a three-tier rate structure in 2019. The highest tiers obviously being higher, the highest tier 3 being the highest rate to help curb that outdoor water use. You can see what our current rates are here. We've been going up on these rates almost every year. I'd say 5 or 6% a year is probably typical. We did do a very large capital upgrade project, a $5 million project 3 years ago, and that had a lot to do with the rate increases as well. But certainly there was some revenue loss that had to play into this rate increase. And so I took that same chart I showed you a few slides ago, and I added our residential use at the very bottom. So you can kind of see how has there been a change in our outdoor and our residential use. And I'll be honest, I don't see much change. 2016 through 2019, we were right around, 60, 70 gallons per day. 2020, was the year of COVID. We had a huge spike in outdoor water use. We are a bedroom community, as I noted. And I think that really carried forward through 2020 and 21, the outdoor use. So I was really curious to see what last year brought 2022. We just finished our ASR. I'm sure many of you have also finished yours. If you haven't, I think they're due in a couple days. But our usage last year was 74 gallons per day, which I thought was actually higher than I thought it would be. I thought it would be down a little lower. But considering the amount of enforcement that we did, I thought it would curb the usage a lot more than it did. But I guess that is what it is. That's the number. I know 2016 we hit 62 gallons per day. I don't know. I don't know if I'll ever get that low. We are, like I said, we're a bedroom community. We do have some nice houses in town, like big lawns, and so that really impacts our residential usage. So some common questions I get from the public. So, what is Southwick doing wrong, and why don't other towns have these restrictions? So I noted earlier that we share the Westfield River Basin with West Springfield and Russell. We are in Western Mass, and I don't think there's any other permits that in the Western region, that's Western part of the Mass, that have similar conditions in our permit like Southwick, with the exception of maybe Northampton, and there may be a community up by Pittsfield. I'm not positive, but certainly none of our neighboring communities have restrictions, and really up until 2016, it was really Western Mass, in this area anyways. It was not even an issue. It was never known. I used to work on the private sector and do some work in Eastern Mass, and I know that communities out there would have restrictions almost every year, but Western Mass, this was a new concept. So, what is Southwick doing wrong? Why is this an issue? And I try to explain that, there's nothing that we're doing wrong. There's nothing we didn't do or we didn't not do that tripped this. This is just, the policy from the state that we need to follow. Just fix the problem, install more wells. It's not that simple. I get a complaint about, water not being available for new development. Southwick is a growing community. We have a lot of open space in town, and the last couple of years there has been a little bit of a boom in construction, and I see that continuing for the next few years. And people think that, oh my God, there's no water available, or we have restrictions every year, so we can't afford, or we can't promote or accept this new development, and that's just not the case. Another complaint I get is, how people's property values are being impacted because, they can't have green lawns anymore. So I have and this is my take on this, from the outside looking in. Here are some things I think that should be looked at. First of all, the drought management task force, I think should meet more frequently. So I know Jen's on that committee, and I know she's pushing for us. But we all know the Mark Twain saying that if you don't like the weather in New England, wait 10 minutes. And I think that's really true here. I don't think the data the task force looks at really is up to date. Having these meetings once a month, I don't think is often enough. I really think they should be meeting. And I know Jen mentioned they met twice a year last year for a part of the year. I think that needs to be the standard moving forward. I know everybody on that committee has other roles, responsibilities, but I just think that, especially if they're going to put these conditions on the new registrations, it needs to be up to date. And I know when the task force meets, they meet, I think usually it's the 4th, 5th, or 6th of the month, and they're not looking at data, they're looking at data from the prior month, not those first 5 or 6 days of that month. And things could change in those days. I had a situation last year, or not last year, probably 3-4 years ago. So as I noted, we have to implement restrictions based on the stream flow or the drought declaration. If one of the two trip, we have to go in restrictions. So I had a situation a few years ago where we were able to pull out of the restrictions based on, I think, the stream flow, but the management task force met, and you know what? 2 days later, I had to go back in restrictions. I never pulled out because I saw that coming, but again, it's just I just think that the data should be looked at more frequently. I think that's my take on that. I also think the standards should be consistent across the board. Jen talked a lot about how the variances between the permanent and registered systems. It's very, very confusing for me, and even more confusing for the public to understand why Southwick, or why can this part of the state do something and why others cannot. I do think that if we're in a drought, that people should be doing their best to conserve water. I think that's, to me, that's clear. I think the state's going about this the wrong way, but I think the standards should be the same across the board, not just picking, certain communities to have certain standards and others to have different. Jen talked about the definition of outdoor water use changing and being different. So in my permit, it says we can establish a new lawn in May and September. Now the new definition is to stabilize soil to a septic repair for a new home. Again, that's conflicting. And, so when other communities, my neighbors, Westfield, Agawam, they have to go over restrictions, they're going to have different standards than we are. And it's very confusing. And another one, I don't understand why, but I know in new permits, they don't have the drought-based restrictions, only the stream flow restrictions. And maybe it's in my permit and not others. I'm not sure, but I'm on the outside looking in. I don't know why that's the case. Again, it goes back to my earlier comment that everything should be more consistent across the board. And that's my take. I appreciate your time, and I'll be around afterwards to answer any questions that any of you may have.
Thanks, Dan. Thank you guys for inviting me to talk about this today. So here in Ipswich, we are advancing our slides. Hang on. We actually span two watersheds here in Ipswich. We span the Parker River and the Ipswich River watersheds. Currently, we have registrations in both watersheds and a permit in the Parker Basin. However, our Parker permit was issued in the early 2000s, and it was actually appealed by the Ipswich River watershed along with a group of citizens. And that appeal has never been resolved in over 20 years. So we haven't had any updates to our permit. So currently, we don't actually have any mandated water restriction requirements yet. Obviously, this is changing now. But again, interesting, I would have a question for Jen that if permits prevail and my old existing appealed permit is still in place, then I would potentially still not have permit requirements. So interesting. Regardless, we were required to establish a drought management plan in the early 2000s as part of our Parker permit that was issued back then. And we since have updated in 2019 due to the severe drought we experienced in 2016, sorry. Here we're actually finding droughts are increasing in frequency and severity. So we're not really, we're focused on not running out of water. Actually, it's not really any like requirement. It's for real, we can run out of water. We're seeing our source production decline due to age. We're a very old water system established in the late 1800s. We also have some quality issues in our sources, manganese and PFAS. The PFAS issue we've resolved at this time, but manganese still restricts some of our higher production sources. So that really hinders our drought response. In the past 20 years, we've actually had 11 summers where we have imposed restrictions of some kind. And in 2016 and 2020, we were actually requested and issued emergency declarations by DEP due to our drought condition. If anybody's in this situation, I just urge you to understand this process. This can provide regulatory relief in that you may be able to exceed your water management withdrawal limits, but they tend to not actually give you any opportunity to add water to your system. So I've learned this. It took me 2 times to learn this. So it actually didn't really help us to do this, and DEP imposes significant conditions upon you when they issue this. So I didn't find it valuable for us, but in certain instances it may be. So in Ipswich, we have our framework established. It's important, as Jen mentioned, to understand your local requirements and to establish those consistent with what DEP is requiring. So we had bylaws and regulations, but in 2016, the drought was so severe, we started issuing penalties and restricting water, and started realizing that our framework actually wasn't quite legally supportive of what we were doing. So we ended up modifying both the bylaw and regulation in 2017. So the bylaw requires town meeting approval. That is sort of a high-level document that sets the legal framework to restrict the water use and assess penalty and details the penalties and violations. We actually took the state's model bylaw and modified it to better align with our current existing practices, which again, we had the flexibility to do because we didn't have any mandated conditions such as some of the other communities do, or that we're going to have. We also did approve the inclusion of private wells in the bylaw so that we actually can restrict the use of private wells. And then our regulations were amended also with the details, though that can be done just with a public hearing by our water commissioners. So that's where sort of the nuts and bolts of what we do are housed, so that we can modify those as necessary, which we're clearly going to have to do. So our process here in Ipswich is to monitor our local conditions. That's what's affecting Ipswich. We have 2 reservoirs and 5 groundwater sources. So we monitor our own reservoir storage, our groundwater levels, our local precipitation, stream flow in the Ipswich and Parker rivers, and we monitor the state drought information as well. Again, we're not required to do any of this, but this is how we've adapted our program. And you can see our drought stages and action levels. We have formulas in the drought management plan that tells us when we move to each of those. Historically, we actually are more restrictive than what the state will be requiring of us. So it'll be interesting to work through these requirements and to determine how we might change what we currently do to be compliant or stay more strict. And so we do issue public notifications. You can see there we have a sign. We put signs out in the major arteries of the community so that people coming and going can understand that. We have a big banner downtown. We use social media, the town website, and we will do reverse 911 also. And we do, I think Jen made the distinction, some people say restrictions, some people say ban. We actually move from restrictions to a full ban on watering. We don't do days of the week. We do hour restrictions, and then we do a full ban. And then we do issue our penalties for violation, which are non-criminal dispositions. And that process is challenging at best. We work with our local police department, and they have guided us that we actually need to see the water spraying. They will not support us if we're just using meter data and complaints from folks. So we've actually gone to court and had cases thrown out, our violations thrown out completely. I wish we could have got the 50% deal that Randy got, but we were not so lucky. We get them just tossed right out. So we're learning. We're in our infancy of this enforcement situation. So basically, we've worked to establish how we're going to do this better going forward. So we use a variety of evidence from public complaints, the meter data, and actually when we get DigSafe tickets for landscapers that are coming into town to do some plantings, I'll notify them and say, you can plant, but you can't water. So we basically use all of these, and we developed a pre-warning letter system because our violation in our bylaw goes from a warning. The first violation is a warning, second violation and onward gets fines. So we established this pre-warning letter to basically say, hey, we know you're watering and here are the rules. And if we catch you, we'll hold you accountable. So that actually helped a lot. That last year was the first year we did that. So that turned out to be a good practice. And then we will move on to violation notices and penalties. And as Randy mentioned, you need to really have that big packet of evidence to support your why you issued your penalties. One thing that I had to learn is that violators need to have time to receive their notices and respond properly. The first time we started issuing penalties, it says daily notices. So I was handing out notices daily, and the police were just like, you can't do that. They need to have time to respond. But that leads to public frustration because we get calls daily. I was getting harassed by the community because they kept seeing an offender, and we were working through the process with them, but they were choosing to continue to water and pay the fines, and that leads to a lot of public frustration. And so it's a really frustrating process, and it's a lot of work for staff to keep up with all the monitoring and issuance of violations. So the other issues that we have in a drought are significant revenue impacts. So when we're restricting water use, it's usually starting around the end of our fiscal years, which is the worst time. So we're restricting what we're getting at the end of our year when we need it. Ipswich actually adopted a residential seasonal rate structure back in 2003 because our residential consumption peaked so significantly in the summer. It's been a very successful program, and it has really flattened the curve of our summer use. And so we basically jack up our rates 1.5 times our normal rate from May through September. And then we drop the rates in the winter months to really offset that. So like it's a revenue neutral program for our customers. They get a huge bill in the summer and they get really small bills in the winter, but it gives us, good revenue in the summer, and it allows us kind of 2 touch points because we do change the rates. So we have public hearings twice a year to modify the rates, which ensures that we can collect enough revenue. The other issue we have is when we have a drought and we're running out of water, we have to balance how we use all of our sources, which can lead to water quality concerns. We haven't experienced any compliance issues in that. Mainly it's sort of just a change that the customers use when we go from mostly surface water to mostly groundwater. The water gets harder, so they notice things in their dishwasher and their showers and things like that. So we've been fortunate to not have any regulatory compliance issues because of it, but it is an issue that we experience. The other issue is the potential exceedance of Water Management Act authorizations. We have, as I mentioned, we have permits and registrations in both Parker and Ipswich. In our Ipswich River watershed, registration is only 200,000 gallons a day. So I have 3 wells in that basin, but I can't use them productively because of my Water Management Act. Again, public relations is an issue. Everyone tends to blame the water department for the drought conditions. So we don't get rain and somehow it's the water department's fault. So we're working on our education of folks and trying to help get out more information about, it's not just Ipswich, it's regional. Up here in the Northeast, a lot of us have a lot of issues. And so it's making us, it's helped last year. The community didn't feel alone, I think, because the drought was so widespread. And then we also have a lot of frustrations over the restriction of private wells. To get around regulations, people like to drill wells and say, you can't touch me, I'll water what I want. And in Ipswich, that's not the case. Interestingly, the enforcement of that is, I find it actually easier because in the past, when we didn't have the restriction on the private wells, we had to know whether people were on a well or not and do some cross-referencing of databases and such. Now it's just, if anybody's watering at the wrong time, it doesn't matter, we just know. But again, we have to see it. So we don't have meter data, but if water's flying, they're in violation. So, and then I just have another note that the private well approval process is fairly flawed in that there's no consideration for the impacts to a public water supply for private wells if they are below the DEP threshold for requiring a permit there. So again, in Ipswich, it's an actual real problem that we need to solve, which is to maintain our water supply through drought. So some of the tools to maintain that, we had unaccounted for water in the high teens a few years back. So we did a water loss audit and some significant capital projects to address our system failures. We also have smart meters and are able to monitor our customer use in a very effective way. We also do monthly billing, which isn't super common in Massachusetts. We are fortunate to be in a utilities department with our municipal electric department. And so that affords us that ability to do monthly billing with them. And that allows us to do our seasonal rates. If you can't track your usage monthly, you can't do seasonal rates. Customers don't have an opportunity to respond to their usage and change their practices. The smart meters and the monthly and hourly data that we get from that has allowed us to do some customer data analysis so that we can learn who our highest users are and target our messaging toward them. A few years back, we did a grant program partnering with the Ipswich River Watershed Association to do a water neutral growth study. And part of that, the Division of Ecological Resources helped us do some analysis of our data to really understand where our customers were using water. And so it's a chart that they had developed where it shows that 60% of our discretionary use, again, not our baseline, this is unnecessary watering. 60% of that discretionary use comes from the top 10% of our residential customers, or only 332 customers. So it's a manageable number to start doing some messaging to. So it's interesting to just look at, the bulk of our customers are doing a good job. And the problem with excessive water is really only happening with a small portion of our customers. So another way to manage that demand, Jen had mentioned the Healthy Lawn, Happy Summer toolkit. It's a great toolkit, but it is, it takes time and energy you've got to call out your data. You've got to follow the toolkit. It gets you going, but it is an effort. So we did target our top 10% of our residential customers, and we sent out the mailings, and we got some feedback back from some of our customers that, hey, I'm not watering, or I have a big family, or I have this, whatever. We got some angry folks that weren't appreciative of learning that they're a high user, but we did get some that were thankful because they really had no idea. They just go about their business and they don't realize they're part of the problem. So last year was our first year doing it. So we're still sort of figuring out whether it was impactful. If not impactful, I still think it's worthwhile because we're communicating with our customers in a positive way and helping them understand that they're part of the problem and they need to address that. Starting at FY23, we were successful in adding a water resources manager position to the water department, which is critical to manage all of this. The needs are great. It's a drain on staff to do this, and it's really everybody's just scattered. And to have a single person focused on this has been huge. She started in October, so this will be her first summer with us. So I'm really looking forward to seeing how that shapes out if we end up having another drought season. That person will also be growing our rebate program, which we have already established through working with our electric department as well. We are also just piloting a new water use survey program, which is an exciting program where we're going to go to people's homes, to their properties, and assess their needs and for watering, their landscaping needs. So we're basically looking at how much lawn do you have, what types of gardens do you have stormwater problems, is there ponding and puddling, do you have wet areas, and how do we maybe plant in the wet areas, take advantage of the stormwater on site, or maybe do some slight tweaks to direct stormwater to a watering area, to a landscape bed, so that you don't have to use municipal water to irrigate and keep your landscape nice. So we're in the pilot stages of that, but I think that's going to be an exciting program. Just our early communication to our customers has been very positive about that program. And then we do have a water use mitigation program that the water commissioners adopted in interim basis in 2021. Right now, it is strictly a fee-based program. So if you add bedrooms as a residential property, or if you, as a commercial customer, you increase your demand based on, building modifications, we charge you fees. Eventually, we would like to grow this into a program where we're not just collecting money, we are actually helping customers mitigate their usage and not add the burden to our system. So that's the goal of that program. But right now, we're happy to collect money and fund some of these programs for the community. So that is all I have.
Down on the Cape, we have varying circumstances as compared to the rest of the state. So, but before I get into that, just a system overview. We have a staff of 15, an annual operating budget of about $4.5 million. We have 14 groundwater sources, 5 corrosion control facilities, and 2 green sand filter plants. We have 3 water storage tanks with a capacity of 3.5 million gallons, and we have about 10,098 metered accounts. Now, our population is, Jen intimated before, varies significantly between winter and summer. So in our winter year-round population, we're around 13,000 residents. In the summer, that balloons up to about 40,000. That can lend itself to some pretty big swings in our annual pumping or daily pumping volume. So in the winter, we're generally pumping between 800,000 gallons to 1 million gallons a day. And in the summer, we're pumping about 5 million gallons on average, and we can have peak days in the 6 to 7 million gallon range. We have 5 well fields that together pump a capacity of about 6,000 gallons per minute. And you look to the graph on the right of the slide here, you can see our pumping capacity at various run times. And looking back at 2010, we were in excess of 20 hours of pump run time to keep up with demand. So things get pretty busy in the summertime. So this slide just looks at our current permitted withdrawal volume. And the chart on the left, you can see this is a summary of the last 9 years of our pumping capacity or pumping usage. And you can see we've exceeded our Water Management Act permit 3 times in the last 9 years. But if you look at the red boldened line, that is the 2022 total, and that is actually the lowest that we've pumped in over 10 years. So we had a pretty significant and good response to the restrictions we put in place last year. So looking at 2022, our issues really began back in 2020. The Monomoy lens, where we withdraw water from, receives recharge predominantly from off-season precipitation, which we didn't get really any between 2020 and presently. You can see the gold part of the bar graph there that you can see we're now trending upward. But like I said, this is the lowest the aquifer's been in over 20 years. So we implemented voluntary odd-even water restrictions in 21, and the Water Commission elected not to lift those restrictions in the fall. Moving into 2022, in May, we reduced the voluntary odd-even to a voluntary 2-day per week restrictions, hoping to, curb usage as we still continue to have limited recharge. With that irrigation usage this past spring, we were getting customer complaints for low pressure, and we moved due to that to a mandatory ban on all outdoor water use effective August 1st, with enforcement to begin August 8th. Now, I can't say how grateful I am that the board voted to do that, because the weekend between adopting the ban and implementing it, we had one of our big wells go down, a 550 gallon per minute well that got bound up with iron. It wasn't less than a week later, the Cape was raised to a level 2 drought declaration. And a day after that, we lost another large producer, 500 gallon per minute well. So we were in tough shape this past summer. So with the adoption of the ban on August 1st, the Water Commission did vote to implement enforcement through fines for violations effective August 8th. They did that to try and give everybody an opportunity to respond to the reactions, reprogram, their irrigation systems, get in contact. Another thing that we have that's unique to the Cape is we're an extremely seasonal community. So it's not everybody with an irrigation system is on site. So we tried to give a little bit of flexibility to residents that were not on Cape to make adjustments to their timers and irrigation systems. Now, this past year was the first time, I believe, in department history, I can say definitively in over 20 years that we have actually enforced the violations with citations and fines. So this was very much a learning process for us. And I'm going to go through kind of all the hardships and heartache we had as part of that process. Now, like most water systems, I'm sure you are all short-staffed and don't have an adequate workforce to go out and police water use. As Randy mentioned, a lot of the water use happens between midnight, 6 a.m., where we're just not staffed. So what we elected to do this year was put an anonymous water restriction violation form on our website that enabled people to report observations of water use restrictions. And with that, we would be cross-referencing, against our well database and trying to validate all that. One of the things that we did immediately after adopting regulations was go out and take a town-wide meter read to establish a baseline for our enforcement. Without sufficient staff or the police, that anonymous form was very helpful for us. We also had a large group of dog walkers, people out in the mornings that would go out for a walk, and they would come home and email the customer service and give us a list of all properties that were using irrigation. So those were the main sources of complaints or for the violations. So between August 10th and August 16th, we wrote 106 written warnings. At the top of the slide here, you'll see a section from the water regulations in town that identify a first offense of written warning, second offense of $100, and third and subsequent as $300. Now, as I mentioned, this was the first time we're actually enforcing these, and one of the things that we realized was that the language in the commission regulations was in conflict with the town's bylaw. The bylaw had no written warning and a first offense of $50 and second and subsequent for $100. So after issuing the first 106 written warnings consistent with the regulations, prior to issuing the first batch of actual citations, I reached out to legal counsel just to make sure that everything we were doing was above board and wouldn't come back to bite us. And that was when we really discovered that the regulations were in conflict with the bylaw. So, sorry here. So the fines within the bylaw also state that they're to be collected through indictment or complaint before the district court or by non-criminal disposition in accordance with MGL Chapter 40, Section 21D, and that each day of violation should constitute as a separate offense. So the MGL Chapter 40, 21D process is extremely onerous, as I'm sure anyone who's gone through it can attest. This past year, we wrote almost double the amount of citations than the Parks and Rec did for beach parking violations. So we were, I want to say, in excess of 500 tickets that were written. And if you, as you can imagine, if we were to write these on a carbon copy ticket book, it's just an immense administrative workload. So what we were able to do to streamline the process was develop a mail merge through Microsoft Word to take our Excel database of violations and auto-populate our citations so that we could get those out quicker and easier. That said, it was still a period of time between when the reports came in and we were able to process, cross-reference, and get those citations out. So they do, and have in some cases, did build up. Once we issue the citation, we need to issue copies to the violator, the town clerk, the district court, and one is retained within the water department. Now, if the violation remains unpaid after 30 days, The department must then submit an application for criminal complaint, sorry, to the district court, along with the associated burden of proof. So the sheet here on the left, we have an example of the application for criminal complaint for the Orleans District Court. This case in particular had multiple violations of water use restrictions. This fine amount was $1,350. And on the right of the slide, you see one of the cover letter for what we used for our burden of proof. Now, throughout this process and prior to issuing the first round of actual citations, I also went down and met with the magistrate at the Orleans District Court to try and see kind of how the process would go, but also what they would be looking for proof, or what they would accept as proof on behalf of the department in these cases. So they were adamant about ensuring that proper public notification had been provided to the residents. So you'll see we have our notification methods with the various voice broadcast messages that we sent. We also operate a reverse 911 system within the water department, so we use that for that purpose. Also ran ads through Cape Cod Chronicle, Cape Cod Times, the various radio stations. We have 15 permanent signboards around that get updated based on the level of restriction. We put 2 mobile signboards out at the major intersections in town, notification on our websites, the local Channel 18. And we also have the ability within our voice broadcast system to capture the phone call, whether it was received, went to an answering machine, and things of that nature. So this is our confirmation that the message did meet or reach the property owner. We also summarize the dates of the reported outdoor sprinkler use, as well as the customer's meter reading, and some, I guess, calculations at the bottom here that estimate approximate monthly usage based on the 65 gallons per day per capita for a family of 4, a family of 6, so that the court could use that to compare against the customer's water reading. We also we don't have a fixed meter network, but we do have eCoder R900 meters. So when available, we would try to also capture a 90-day history of water use at the individual properties, and that would also be supplemented in with this packet that went to the courts. So as the other presenters mentioned, the impact of water restrictions is pretty significant with respect to budgets and things of that nature. So I have a slide here. For our department, we capture about 50% of our revenue from our summer quarter. So the impacts of water restrictions can be pretty significant. If you look at the middle center upper part, you can see our quarterly revenue from the summer quarters of 2019 through 2022. And comparing, 21 to 22, we had about $260,000 less in revenue. And when we go back to 2020, that was a $500,000 difference between what we collected in 2020 versus 2022. And with that, we also had a rate increase during that period. So those losses would be even greater had we not. We also have a huge summer fluctuation in pumping volume. 21 to 22, we were about 57 million gallons less. And going back to 2020, we were 155 million gallons less this year in 2022. So as for the stats, this past year, we issued 248 citations totaling $50,200. 171 of those were paid or have since been paid. So we've collected about $36,800 from those. 22 citations have been contested in the amount of $9,250. We were able to avoid 21 citations. That was things due to people being on wells or other circumstances that warranted us avoiding those citations. And we do still have 34 that remain unpaid and that we have not yet submitted the application for criminal complaint. The reason we didn't for those remaining 34 is due to the fact that the magistrate said don't send us any fines, in the amount of $50 or $100. It's a waste of everybody's time. That said, one thing that the magistrate did say in reference to that is that there is a statute of limitations with respect to enforcement of violations of this kind, in that she had believed it was a 5-year statute of limitations. And she had said that if we have a $50 or $100 citation that we issued last year, we could then pick up with the subsequent fine amounts in future years if they remain unpaid. And if they do get to a point where they're, several $100s, that we could move forward with petitioning for the application for criminal complaint. We do have some hearings scheduled with Orleans District Court beginning and end of April. So I don't have an output yet, but I hope we at least get the 50%, if not collection of the full fines. Some lessons learned that we had, as I mentioned, this was our first year, so it was definitely a learning experience. Make sure you confirm your bylaws and your regs are consistent. It's a lot easier to amend the commission's regulations, so it's not impossible that there could have been changes there that haven't been put into effect or reconciled with the town bylaw. So you want to make sure that those are consistent. Also develop a game plan for enforcement, what your burden of proof is going to be, your documentation, ticket issuance, and tracking. As I mentioned, we were able to do the mail merge for issuing the tickets, which was a huge help in trying to get those out the door in a timely fashion. If you have an opportunity, try and meet with your clerk magistrate to have a discussion with them about what your plan is prior to implementing it, because you may have to pivot depending on what they're going to be looking for. You want to discuss your enforcement strategy with legal counsel to make sure that they are in line, everyone's on board with what the process is going to be. You may also want to consider funding a seasonal position for enforcement. That's something that we are considering now. One of the things that we were hoping to do in response to our experience last year was to enact special legislation that would allow us to not use the non-criminal disposition process, but instead apply violations for water use restrictions to the user account. That said, we are no longer pursuing that, because after working with legal counsel to try and draft the language to submit to the state for approval, legal counsel was going to require an additional hearing, essentially, in advance of assessing the fine. So once we identified a violation, legal counsel wanted to establish an additional due process where we would have a violation citation hearing. If the hearing determined that the citation was warranted, it would then be assessed to the user account. But that process of having the hearing was going to be more cumbersome than going through the non-criminal disposition process. So the Water Commission elected not to go forward with that. So we're now instead currently considering funding a seasonal position to support us should we find ourselves in restrictions again. As it was previously mentioned, this is an immense administrative burden to employ and track and keep on top of the water restrictions. So just know that as you're getting into it. As it was also previously mentioned, we got beat up considerably by the public. We were putting people out of business, landscapers concerned that they weren't going to have any grass to mow. Anything you can imagine, it came at us. And there was also a fair amount of people that called and said, well, I'm not going to listen to the restrictions, I'm going to water. Anyway, regardless, we have a decent affluent portion of the community that can afford to pay these fines. So we did have a number of residents that just watered all summer and paid a couple $1,000 fines and went on with their life. We also had, one person on the phone with one of our admins that just said, oh, I'm eating a bagel, I can't go turn off my irrigation. So you get a whole litany of things. I would also recommend, trying to develop some de-escalation strategies to support the frontline employees. Like I said, we were getting beat up pretty hard. So one of the things that we did, we set up an auto prompt in our phone system so that when people call, dial 1 for customer service, dial 2 for treatment concerns, or dial 3 for water violation. And we had an automated message that explained the process for payment. Payments needed to be to the town clerk. If you were contesting, it needed to be done through the citation process, and it wasn't something that we were hearing within the department. And another thing is to try and, whenever possible, coordinate with the neighboring communities. We did have a group of, the neighboring water systems prior to adopting regulations, and we try to be consistent across towns, because it's, when you drive from one town to the next, and the town of Dennis can water, but the town of Harwich can't, it definitely inspires some confusion with the public. So that's definitely something, if you can do it, you definitely want to. In the case of last summer, we were heading out on a consistent basis, but ultimately, when the Water Commission in Harwich went to enforcement with fines and violations, the neighboring communities, as I understand it, did not go that route. So we were in somewhat of a different scenario. With respect to the proposed changes to the regulations, going back to the drought in 2016, it was a unique situation, especially on Cape Cod, where, as I mentioned before, all of our recharge comes from off-season precipitation. And going into 2016, we had an abundance of it. So we had a very high water table. We had all the water that we wanted to use. And the situation was somewhat different on the Upper Cape. I believe it was Falmouth. Some of the observation wells up there were in the red. And DEP imposed a broad brushstroke of regulations, of drought restrictions Cape-wide. Back in 2016, Harwich elected not to implement water use restrictions because we had an abundance of groundwater. But that's one of the issues with the proposed new regulations, is that they're saying we'll have to go into water restrictions if we have drought triggers from groundwater levels, or if there's a drought declaration. When we look at 2016, no matter what precipitation would have occurred during the summer that could have changed those drought declarations, it would have mattered for us because none of it hits the aquifer. So it's going to be real interesting as we move forward on the Cape as to how frequently droughts are imposed upon us, especially relative to the available water beneath in the aquifer. So.
My name's Todd Melanson. I'm the environmental compliance manager with the Chelmsford Water District. I've been here since they initiated the position of environmental compliance manager. So I've been here a bit. Large part of my job is the summer management program. Give you an idea, we're a district, so we are a municipal entity, but we are separate from the town. So we have our own officers, our own bylaws. We work cooperatively with the town, but we are separate from the town government. We are a system of 20 groundwater wells, 3 treatment plants. The 2 primaries are green sand with aeration, and the seasonal plant is a membrane filtration plant. We have 5 storage tanks, 3 booster stations. So there's a lot to go on with our system. We also pull from 2 different watersheds. I have registered volumes in both the Concord and the Merrimack. I have an additional source permit in the Concord and a new source with no additional volume in the Merrimack. My permit, I'm operating off of the draft permit currently as we work to negotiate the Concord or the permit renewal. We give you an idea of the why. The permit requirements are in there that I have a summer management program because I am both registered and permitted. But a large part went into it before the Water Management Act really started getting into this. In the drought of 1988 to 1990, the district lost all of its capacity, or not all of it, but a significant amount that we lost pressure in the system, required us to hook up our emergency connection with Lowell. We actually had to purchase a pumper trailer that hooks up between 2 separate vaults and be able to pump, just because our pressure is significantly higher than Lowell's. This actually required them to construct the Chelmsford Water District Summer Management Program. In all three districts, Chelmsford's not a unique, but definitely in the minority of a town with multiple water entities in it. The Chelmsford Water District is larger than the other two significantly. We're anywhere from 78 to 80% of the town, where the other two are much less. We coordinate and cooperate on the restriction programs. The people previous to this were very succinct in saying you need to be in line with not only your neighbors. Well, for me, it's I have to be in sync with my other districts, so to avoid confusion. And that's the why. We have our program is we have 3 levels. It's odd even days. Level 1 is 6 to 9 in the morning or 6 to 9 at night only. And you have to pick one. Level 2 is 6 to 9 at night only, and level 3 is a complete ban. Except with the exceptions, and we don't allow new lawn watering in new lawns or sod in the summer. The stance is it's probably not when you should be doing it anyways. It won't take, and they'll have to reseed it. So if we're in a level 3 or in the outside of the restrictions, we do not allow watering. And that is the way the program runs right now. Communication, I guess, for me is key to the compliance. For me, changing the word from ban to restriction was important. In the day-to-day conversations that I have with the residents on this, that seemed to help a lot. So just be very careful on the words you use. And finding easier ways to communicate. I have a stream gauge that I'm attached to. I have a groundwater monitoring well. I use the pictures off of the USGS website on the things that are specific to the district to highlight where we are, where the aquifer is. Go anywhere from the stream gauge where, so mine is, I have a cap at 71 cubic feet per second for it's the 7-day low flow trigger. And when I do it, I also use it to make sure I'm comparing last year's, the median, and over a year, so people can see where we are for the whole year. Also, we have our own weather station, and we track the precipitation, both snow and water. Basic conversion for snow is 7 inches of snow equals 1 inch of rain, and it kind of averages out. I mean, sometimes it's wetter or drier, but on average, it's 8 inches of snowfall equals 1 inch of rain. And you use this, show that I have the regional average, I have the state average, it's been in existence now for 12 years. So I've got our own 12-year average. We also use the infrastructure, letting them know where we stand on the wells, the storage tanks. I have the 5 storage tanks I have. They're pretty much where I get my fire protection pressure. So using that as a tool to explain why we change. And we do, I'll be honest with you, we change our restrictions consistently almost every year, going from 1 to 2, and then if we have to, on the rare occasion, go to level 3. And the other things we use are the graphics from the State Drought Task Force, the drought declaration. The other one, which I find really helpful, is the Water Resources Commission's hydraulic conditions report on a monthly basis. And why I use that is DCR Fire gives a report on the fire conditions statewide and showing the increase or the chance for large scale wildfires, forest fires in the state. And I think a lot of people would be surprised at the number of them. That has been one of my biggest and better tools that I've used recently. And those are my, and using those reasons, that's what we do. Also, I don't mind laying it on the state either. The permit requirement is from them, and so I'm required to have it. So that's kind of the way we go about that. Let's see. The results, I'll be honest with you. For me, I don't mind the irrigation systems so long as I can support and control them. For me, we chlorinate. I do have issues with disinfectant byproducts, chlorine residual, maintaining it in the far ends of the system. I do worry when we go to the level 3 ban about certain the increase in disinfectant byproducts, the potential for creation of biofilms and having bacteria hits. So I get very nervous down those. So the irrigation systems allow me to keep the system moving so long as I can control it and stay within my requirements of the permit and the water conservation standards. My residential population does an outstanding job. We average about 54 gallons per person per day, and that's over a decade of being in that level. It requires constant communication, and that's a large part of my job. I would check into, if you don't, I would do an annual report to your Board of Selectmen. We do things like a lot of the local libraries have outreach programs. If you do a presentation on the importance of why you're doing that and things like that, if you're not, it's something I would take advantage of. But being out in the community, for me, the way we enforce it is it's on me. I do morning patrols. When I find one, it's kind of easy. They're either watering while I'm there, or the telltale water ring sign, and you can see that they've been watering, and it's pretty easy if it's odd even. The other thing is what I will do is we don't have AMI, but we do have data download capability on a drive-by, and we will download 90 days of usage that I need as backup, potentially. I track it. For us, the enforcement part is first is a verbal warning. I will pull in and I will stop. The second is a written warning, and then the levels of fines are $50, $150, and $300. And it's not per year. So if you violate 1 year, and what we will do the next year is it will be a written warning first, and then you will jump to level 2 and consecutively. Once you get to level 3, you stay there year in and year out. To have it be successful, you do have to do the enforcement, and they haven't lied. It is a significant staff time commitment. If I'm working on something, it pretty much goes on hold until we can get a handle on it. For me, it's not a revenue issue. I'm a compliance person. The revenue I'll leave to other people. Mine is making sure that we're in compliance with the Water Management Act and that we're keeping the system healthy as possible. I would, if you do change, make sure you're reporting the changes on the form to the state, to Mass DEP, Jen Durso. And I think that's about it. And I will close that out.